Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. I feel so guilty saying it because I have been gone for, I think, about 4 months. It's embarrassing. School has been absolutely draining, and then also during the summer I worked a lot, so I couldn't really film that many videos. All of those different things were just literally draining the creative juices out of me, and I could not think of anything interesting to film. And obviously I don't want to film videos that I'm not genuinely into, like videos that I'm not passionate about. I don't know, does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Anyways, it is currently December 26th. I hope you guys can see that. Okay, well, there we go. It's currently December 26th, the day after Christmas, and I decided to film a little reading wrap-up. Anyways, this year I read 24 books, and for me personally that's an impressive number because the most books I've ever written, like for pleasure and like willingly, has been 20 books. Like that has been my record. 20 books was like the most I've ever read in a year. However, this year I managed to read 24, and actually I plan on reading one more book before the year ends, which I'll get into like towards the end of the video. But as of right now, I just kind of wanted to do a little reading wrap up and show you guys each and every single book that I read. Let's get into the video. Okay, so first I'm going to start off with the books that I rated 1 star. First book that I have here is The Beast That Shouted, Love at the Heart of the World by Harlan Ellison. This book was terrible. I did not like it whatsoever. It's actually an anthology. It's a short story collection. I got this secondhand at like I don't know, I got this secondhand, that's all. And I got it because the cover was actually quite interesting. Like I really liked this cover design. It's very like 70s-ish. I'm pretty sure this book came out in like the 50s or 60s, but I really like the cover, and so I decided to get it. Believe it or not, I started reading this book last year, and it took me a little over an entire year to finish this short little book because of how painfully boring this was. This just truly showed me that I am not a big fan of sci-fi, especially 60s, 70s sci-fi. It's just not my thing. So this is definitely a 1-star book. The next book that I rated 1 star is Fly on the Wall by E. Lockhart. I did not like this book at all. The reason that I picked it up though is because one of my favorite booktubers, Ariel Bissett, always rants about this book. She loves it. She recommends it to a lot of people. However, I personally wasn't a big fan, unfortunately. I really wanted to like this book because the concept sounds very interesting. Basically, the entire point of this book is that there's this girl that one day wakes up and realizes that she has been turned into a fly. And it sounds like an interesting concept. It reminds me a little bit of Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, which I'm pretty sure this is kind of like loosely based off of. But this book was just not it. The writing style is very like childish. However, it's not necessarily a middle grade, but it feels like I'm reading a middle grade novel. However, there are a few points in this book that are problematic. It's actually problematic. Unfortunately, some of it was actually kind of perverted. I'm going to use a lot of words. Perverted is going to be a very popular word amongst the books that I rated 1 stars, and that is usually why I rate books 1 stars when they are like unintentionally/intentionally perverted. It's just gross. I don't like reading books like that, especially books that don't really intend to be perverted. So yeah, but this book was just terrible. I did not like it at all. I really wanted to like it though, but unfortunately I didn't. Next book that I'm going to show you is Pizza Girl by Jean Kyung Fraser. This has been one of my most anticipated books of the year, I guess you can say. I think it came out about 2 years ago, but I've been wanting to read it ever since it came out. And I picked it up finally at Barnes & Noble, and I don't know, the cover honestly sold me. It's not typically like a cover design that I would go for. However, I don't know, it was just really interesting to me, and it has like a whole bunch of different like images on here, which kind of looks like the story has a lot to it and that it can be like a fun ride. Anyways, again, this book was just terrible. There's a lot of people that like this book because I went through the Goodreads ratings, and unfortunately, a lot of people like this book. It was so terrible. It was like literally the worst book I read this year, I think. Out of all the 1-star books, I think maybe I would choose this one. This wasn't a slow burn. However, it was so painfully like awkward and, like I said, perverted. Like, this is definitely not the type of book that I personally would go for and read. So I'm gonna have to say a major no to this one. I gave it 1 star. And I wrote an entire rant about it. I wrote an entire freaking rant. You're not going to be able to see, but I ranted a lot about this book to people. I did not like it, which is really unfortunate because I really wanted to like it. The cover is very pretty, or interesting at least, I don't know. But yeah, thankfully those are the only books that I rated 1 star this year, but 3 is more than enough. 3 is way too many. Next, I'm going to move on to the books that I rated 2 stars, because I have not rated any book this year 1.5, so I'm just going to be going on to my 2-star books, which I only have 2 of. So first book is Island Summer by Janine Lanai. I flew to Cancun with my family for spring break, and I was scattering my bookshelves for like a summary book, and the literal only book that I found was this like little middle grade / like YA type book. It's called Island Summer. Judging by the cover, I already knew that this book was going to be like super, I don't want to say it, but crappy. Like, it's just going to be one of those like super cheesy and dorky type, like quirky, fun little like girl meets boy type book. And that was exactly that. It was exactly what I expected, but maybe worse. The reason I gave it 2 stars is because like I still kind of enjoyed the crappiness of this book, even though it was terribly written and very just like, I don't know. I'm not really gonna get into it. It's boring, however, like some of the cheesiness can be very like funny. I'm terrible at describing books. Let's just move on. The other book that I rated 2 stars this year is By the River Piedra, I Sat Down and Wept by Paulo Coelho, which, funny enough, I brought this book alongside this one to on my vacation when I went to Cancun, and I gave both of them 2 stars, which happened to be the only 2-star books of the year, which is kind of unfortunate, but I picked up this book because I am familiar with Paulo Coelho's work. I have read Hippie, which was his autobiography / like memoir. It's more of like a memoir. And then I also read The Alchemist last year, and I enjoyed both of those books. They were really good. And so I decided that I wanted to familiarize myself with his other work, and I did, and it just didn't really work out that well. This just proves to me that the books that aren't talked about are just not good. But I like the cover though. The cover is pretty stunning. Let me show you. The cover is pretty stunning. Next, I'm going to move on to my 2.5 star books. Alright, so the first book that I have here is Year of the Tiger by Alice Wong. This is actually a book that I won through a Goodreads giveaway, and I was super excited, and then it showed up at my door, and I decided to read it straight away because when I flipped through this book, it was super cool. Like, it just has like a lot of like things to it. Like, this book has like pictures and poems and diary entries and tweets and posts and texts and stuff. So this book is just full of everything. It's literally Alice Wong's entire life. Well, not entire life, but kind of crammed into one book. And I was really hoping to enjoy this, and I'm going to be honest with you, the first maybe 2/3 of this book, or like the first half of this book, was quite interesting. I was reading it, I was really enjoying it, but then the second half really kind of started to repulse me. The second half of the book started to be a little bit more political, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It started to be not only really, really repetitive, this book was insanely repetitive. It could have easily been like this short, but this book was repetitive, and it started to become really, really political, which is like, I don't know, not a really good thing when it comes to like books, because you want to kind of include every audience. You want everyone to read your book and enjoy it. And this book is mainly about this woman's sort of life with disability. It's written by, like I said, Alice Wong, which is an Asian American disabled woman, and this book was pretty much all about like her disabilities and like her life, and like just trying to shed some light on it and show like the good parts about it, because usually people will look at a disabled person and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, but they don't realize that their life isn't really much different than ours. And I thought this was a really, really interesting concept. I really was interested to kind of like educate myself on that topic, but then it just started to kind of not just go down, and it just wasn't that great. So that is why I am giving this book 2 stars. 2.5. 2.5. And then the other book that I gave 2.5 stars to is The Harley Quinn Tea Set and Other Stories by Agatha Christie. This is another anthology. It's just kind of like a little jumble mumble of some of her short stories that have either, I think, never been published before, and someone kind of put them all together into one book. I'm pretty sure, because I read a little like introduction or something about that. But anyways, I went ahead and I gave each individual short story a rating. And then in the end, I kind of calculated it all and decided to give the book the overall like rating of all the short stories. And it turned out to be 2.5. So that is why I gave this book 2.5 stars. It's really hard to describe short story collections because they're so broad. Like the short stories don't usually go together. But all I'm going to say is that like there's like mystery, there's love, romance, all of that. But not that great. It was just like an alright type of book. Like there was nothing really truly interesting about this book. I've given her so many chances and each time I read her book, I just find myself being super disappointed. Alright, now for my 3-star books. The first one that I have here is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a really short little classic book and it happened to be my 3rd ever book that I read by John Steinbeck. I'm really trying my best to enjoy his writing because there's so many people out there that absolutely love his books. However, I'm really finding it hard to enjoy his books because his writing style is alright. Like, I find it quite witty and funny most of the time, but, like, the stories tend to be really, really drawn out, as most classics tend to be anyway. But yeah, I give it 3 stars because it's not terrible, it's not amazing, so I obviously had to give it some kind of, like, a middle ground type rating. But yeah, it's just kind of like a story about 2 men trying to follow their goals and dreams and trying to work hard and achieve like the American dream. However, they end up just kind of living this like slave type life. I don't really know how to explain books. I'm terrible at describing books. That is why I will probably just keep my mouth shut and tell you my rating of each book. So yeah, that is Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. And then the other book that I gave 3 stars to is The Butterfly Lampshade by Amy Bender. This is a book that I bought last year in Washington on an island called Bainbridge. And I got this at a really, really cute little bookstore, and I thought it was really beautiful and I really wanted a book from there, and I bought this book because of the cover. I thought the cover was really enchanting, very beautiful. At that time, I don't think that anymore. I feel like it's just kind of like it's an okay cover, but at the time I was really mesmerized by the cover, and so I bought this book, and it has been sitting on my shelves and collecting dust, and I finally decided to pick it up this year, and I read it, and honestly speaking, this just wasn't the best book I read, but it wasn't also, again, terrible. That's why I ended up giving it 3 stars, because it was okay. Now, the reason I didn't particularly enjoy this book as much as I wish I wanted to is thoroughly because of the fact that it was really, like, the writing style is so strange. Like, I found it really, really hard to read this book and, like, have my focus completely on it. Like, I finished this book realizing that I barely remembered, like, half of what happened in this book. I find that this book is very forgettable. The story is a very forgettable story. There's nothing really too special or too original about this book, so I ended up just giving it 3 stars. Now we have Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson, which is the only book this year that I gave 3.5 stars to. I went into this book thinking it was like YA, but I realized that this is actually a middle grade novel, and that is exactly why I gave it 3.5 stars and not higher, because of the fact that it was just, I don't want to say childish, but the writing style, or like the writing was below my level, and I just felt like it was super simplified, and I personally am not like someone that tends to read middle grade. And so I gave it 3.5 stars solely because of that fact that it was like super, super simplified and super like below my level, I guess you can say. Which I should have known going into this, because maybe if I knew that this was a middle grade, I maybe would have had a different outlook on it. This is a book about like basically what it means to be a young black girl in America, and it's a very raw story. It's deeply upsetting, yet it's also inspirational, and I feel like this is definitely a book that I would recommend to younger children. So yeah, this is Piecing Me Together by Renee Watson. Next, I'm going to be going into the books that I gave 4 stars to, which happen to be 4 books. First book that I have here on my stack is Heaven by Mieko Kawakami. I am a huge fan of Asian translated literature. I absolutely love reading Asian literature. It just always happens to be so magical and so interesting. And so this year I realized that I haven't read any Asian literature, and so I had to pick something up, and I decided to read Heaven by Mieko Kawakami. I don't know why I'm like saying the same thing over and over again. I'm really sorry for the people watching this video. It's a story about a young boy getting bullied for his lazy eye by his classmates. He's getting like beaten up and like all sorts of different things. So trigger warning for the people that like don't want to read things like that. He ends up befriending a girl, a fellow classmate, who also gets intensely bullied by the girls in that classroom. And she gets bullied for the fact that she's dirty or she doesn't bathe and all these different things. And these two kind of form this like alliance, and it's just kind of their friendship and what it means to build a friendship on top of trauma and where that leads you and how the relationship works and everything. And it's just a really beautiful book. It's a quick read, yet it's very, very powerful and inspirational. Next book that I have here is Saving CC Honeycutt by Beth Hoffman. I got this book at a thrift store because I thought this cover was so grandma-esque. Like, how is it not? Literally look at the cover. Anyways, I also got this book because the description on the back really reminded me of The Secret Life of Bees by Sue Monk Kidd, which happens to be one of my all-time favorite books of all time. Anyways, this book ended up being quite similar to The Secret Life of Bees. However, obviously, I feel like no book will ever reach that level of amazingness. This story follows a young girl with parents that seem to be pretty absent from her life. We have a mother that deals with mental illness, and then we have a dad that's always working in different states and is never home. And this girl pretty much has to learn how to not only take care of herself, but also her mother, and it's just deeply upsetting and just, it's exhausting to read as well as like the reader. You truly feel her pain and like her hard work and her fears. Anyways, one day the mother unfortunately passes away, and this girl ends up being sent away to her super rich, super frivolous, and fun aunt that ends up, I think she lives in a completely different state. And it's basically this girl's sort of like, it's like a coming of age story of this girl like finally being able to like understand herself, learn about like her hobbies, and be able to branch out and have this like normal, healthy childhood. And it's a very fun book. It's very witty, but it's also upsetting. So I feel like this is definitely one of those like feel-good type books that I would highly recommend if you are a big fan of The Secret Life of Bees, just like me. The last 4-star book that I have here is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. This is actually the very first book that I read this year, and it was alright. It was not as good as I really wanted it to be. When I read romances, I really want it to be like super sweet and pure, and I don't really want it to be like super steamy, which this ended up being just that, so that is why I did not give it 5 stars. But overall, I like the enemies to lovers concept, but it just didn't really do it for me in terms of like being as good. I don't really know. I still ended up giving it 4 stars, which now looking back, I don't know why I gave it 4 stars. I feel like if I were to change this rating, I would probably change it to like probably 3 stars. But it was pretty fun. It was interesting. It's definitely like the type of book that you fly through. I don't know. It was alright. So I probably should change the rating. Next, I'm going to be showing you guys the books that I gave 4.5 stars to. First book that I have here is The Nutcracker by Alexandre Dumas. I'm not sure. This cover is absolutely beautiful. Anyways, this is my most recent read book. I really enjoyed this book. It was very Christmassy. I really wanted to read this book during Christmas time, and that is exactly what I did. I read it in this same exact spot with the fireplace and the lit up Christmas tree, and it just like really built up that mood for me. I feel like everyone is pretty familiarized with the Nutcracker story, so I'm not really getting super into detail about the book and like what it's about. But all I'm going to say is that it was really enjoyable and a perfect read for Christmas time. Next book that I gave 4.5 stars to is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Wait, I think I gave this book 4 stars, not 4.5. Whatever, let's just go along with it. Anyways, next we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and surprisingly, I enjoyed it. I went into this book thinking that it's going to be super like drawn out, that the language is going to be super like outdated and completely above my level, which that did come out to be true. However, it was really interesting. There were some parts in this book that made me deeply uncomfortable, but once you get past those parts, this book ends up being super like riveting and enthralling, and you just want to keep on reading more and trying to find out what happens with the portrait of Dorian Gray and all of it. If you are not familiarized with this book, it's basically about a young man named Dorian Gray who ends up getting this like portrait painted of him. And at the time of this portrait, he is young, he is beautiful, and he doesn't understand that he's beautiful. He doesn't acknowledge the fact that everyone's looking at him, and he doesn't understand the jealousy of other people. But once this portrait is revealed to him, he finally understands his beauty. He sees it for himself in his like own eye. He's like, oh my gosh, I am beautiful. And he ends up kind of unintentionally switching places with the portrait. This portrait ends up aging instead. And it's just a really scary type of book, and but it's really interesting. But yeah, that is my 4-star book, but for some reason I put it in my 4.5-star pile. Next book that I have here is Balcony People by Joyce Landorf Heatherly. This is a really short book. I got this at a thrift store. I've absolutely never heard of this book before. However, I really enjoyed it. It's a book written by a Christian author, and I personally am a Christian, but I've realized after finishing this book, I realized that I just don't read Christian literature. I don't read like that genre. I don't read that much about religion, unfortunately, because this book was very interesting. This book also talks a lot about like affirmers and how important it is to affirm other people and affirm ourselves and the power of affirmations, which can be very useful in life. Really short, and I would definitely recommend it. I'm gonna move this little stack over. I'm not sure if you can see this stack. I'm going to put it here. The next book that I read this year that I gave 4.5 stars to is The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest by Stieg Larsson. This is the third and final book of the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo trilogy. Now, the series does go on because after the author's death, there is like another person that ended up carrying on the series and writing more books about these characters, but I personally am not going to continue reading those because I believe that only one true author can write the story, and that is Stieg Larsson. In any case, I absolutely loved the first 2 books. They are hard to get into though. Like the first 100 pages of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo are pretty boring, but once you get past that point, the book is so intensely interesting. There's plot twist beyond plot twist, and it's so incredibly written. I would highly recommend reading these books. But this year, I finally concluded the trilogy. I finally read the third and final book, and I enjoyed it so very much. Now, I'm going to be finally going on to the books that I gave 5 stars to. These books are literally, it's so unfortunate that I literally read 24 books so far, and I've only given 5 books 5 stars. But here we are. The first book that I have here is You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogel. This is quite surprising because I personally am not the type of person to read romance books. However, I picked this one up because it sounded really interesting. It's a lovers to enemies to lovers trope, which is really complicated, but it's really interesting. It's essentially about this couple that is engaged. However, they both kind of realize that they're not right for each other. They don't really love each other anymore. And basically, they can't really, and the interesting part about this book is that they cannot really just tell each other those things because essentially they would be breaking off the engagement, which they can't do because so much money is already put into the engagement that whoever ends up backing out first has to bear the burden of those costs, if that makes any sense. And basically what they do is they pull a whole bunch of pranks on each other throughout this book. They do everything that they possibly can so that the other person has had enough and they just leave the relationship, therefore carrying the burden of the costs that have already gone into the engagement and the planning and everything. And basically what happens is that they end up realizing that they do love each other. Now that they are being fully themselves in front of each other and doing all these things to disgust each other and to annoy each other, they both kind of realize that they are low-key soulmates and that they are made for each other and that they're more similar than they thought, and that there's a lot about each other, or there's a lot about each person that the other didn't know. And it's a very interesting book, probably the funniest book that I read this year, and I'm so glad that I picked it up because it was so good. Please read this. Next book that I have is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This is a book that I got on eBay because I really wanted to read this book. Like I felt like I needed to read it because I'm 18 and I've absolutely never picked this book up, which is embarrassing because I feel like this is a book that people read kind of like at a younger age, which is really weird because this book deals with a lot of like harsh topics. I really wanted to get this book in this edition, so that's why I had to go to eBay to find it, and I did, and I got it for a cheap price. Score. This book was absolutely beautiful. Atticus Finch is now my favorite book character of all time. I absolutely love him to death. He is amazing. I'm not really gonna get into like describing this book because there's so much to it that I'm just gonna fumble and look really, really stupid. All I'm gonna say is that this is definitely a 5-star read and I highly, highly recommend it. Next, I have Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. This book was published this year. And I think this is the only book that I read this year that was also published this year, so I'm happy that I did read something entirely new. This is a friends to lovers type of trope, and I really enjoyed it. This book was so good. It was just so sweet and so pure and so cute, and yeah. From what I remember, this book has kind of like a dual timeline sort of thing, so like one chapter will be like a chapter from like the past, like a story from the past, and then the next chapter will be like present time, like future, past and future. Or not future, but like the present. And it was so interesting to read. It was wonderfully written, and I believe this is Carly Fortune's debut novel. And if I'm right about that, she's going to do super well in her writing career. And the last books that I'm going to be showing you are written by the same author, which is Mitch Albom. So the first book that we have here is Have a Little Faith, and then we have The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. So my obsession with Mitch Albom started when I read Tuesdays with Morrie, which is Chef's Kiss. Amazing book. It's so good. And I realized that that man is absolutely magical. He's a phantom. He's a legend. He is a myth. He is amazing. I love his writing style. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful. It's amazing. Like, every time he writes, it just feels like a warm hug. Like, it feels like home. It's so nice. Anyways, I decided that I will literally read anything that that man frickin' writes. I will read his grocery lists, okay? That is why I decided to read these 2 books. I found them at a thrift store and I felt like I just had to get them. The first book that we have here is The 5 People You Meet in Heaven, which is very, very beautiful and very, like, genuinely interesting. It is about an old man that unfortunately passes away at an amusement park. And it basically kind of we follow him into the afterlife. He ends up going to heaven and he meets 5 individual people that explain to him his life and explain why certain events had to take place and why they happened. And yeah, there's a lot of like answers that end up being like, I don't know, there's a lot of things that they explain to him. It's like each person has like a different purpose. Like each person that talks to him played a different role in his life, whether he has met the person or not. I really hope that I'm doing this book justice because it's really, really good. On his 80th birthday, Eddie dies in a tragic accident, trying to save a little girl from a falling cart. With his final breath, he feels 2 small hands in his and then nothing. He awakens in the afterlife where he learns that heaven is not a lush Garden of Eden, but a place where your earthly life is explained to you by 5 people who were in it. These people may have been loved ones or distant strangers, yet each of them changed your path forever. One by one, Eddie's 5 people illuminate the unseen connections of his earthly life. As the story builds to its stunning conclusion, Eddie desperately seeks redemption in the still unknown last act of his life. Was it a heroic success or a devastating failure? The answer, which comes from the most unlikely of sources, is as magical and inspirational as a glimpse of heaven itself. And then it just goes on and on and on. But this book is beautiful. It's amazing. Please read it. And then we have a Little Life, a true story, which follows a pastor and a rabbi and this book is just amazing. It's so good. Just read it. I'm not really going to get into it because this video is going to be 5 hours long, but this was great. Now, I do have 2 books. I read 2 books for school that I thoroughly enjoyed and decided to count them into this video, and the first one being Night by Elie Wiesel, which is a story of Elie Wiesel himself and his time in Auschwitz. It's terrible. It's super sad, but I feel like it's a must-read. And then I also ended up reading The Great Gatsby by S. Scott Fitzgerald, which unfortunately I do not own a copy of, but hopefully someday I will purchase it for myself. That book I loved and enjoyed so much. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt like it was very glamorous. It definitely gives you the vibe of like the 1920s, the flapper dresses, like everything. And I would definitely recommend reading that book. So that is another book that I will be adding to my little stack if I only owned a copy. And lastly, I have one last book to show you, and that is Can This Be Christmas? By Debbie Macomber. This is a really, really short book that I am currently reading, and so by the time you see this video, I'll be already finished with it, so I decided to kind of already show you this book and add it to my stack. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I'm really happy that I finally got around to filming a video. Anyways, see ya!